always like in-person events, well, despite all these online events, so we're all very overwhelmed by what's happening on this sort of like Wi-Fi platform. So it's very delighted to see you all face to face. And even more so, I mean, today we had guests from Chicago, long way, flying from America to the UK, so escaping Thanksgiving, I was told. Professor Metropolitan University, some of you may have heard about her name already, because she was with us in some of those online series some years ago, so you may have come across her work as well on some of those platforms, and the seminar was also archived in Preacher website. So we have Metal today in person, and very welcome to London. And even better is that she is launching her book, Monumental Cares, and we have it all here. And I have a very good news for all of you, and if you're really into that, and I'm sure that you will, we have a discount. So if you go to Manchester University Press website, look for the book, you put Rich 30, that would be 30% off. Okay? Mark it down. We're not going to put it on the website and let everybody knows. And we also do not know how long that's going to last. So really, special offer, Black Friday.
So I asked them to set it up, and I know that they will at some point take it down again. But I don't know what their, procedure is exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, please do snap up.
Midnight tonight.
Yes, exactly. Please don't wait too long. I was also realizing, in fact, I just keep on saying the welcome without actually introducing myself, but I'll very quickly do that, but I'm not relevant today, so obviously today we have our guest, and I'm going to pass on to, let's say, third introduction to the guest, but I am the Wesley Professor in Transcultural Arts and Design at London Met. I'm also Director of Preacher, working very closely with our Deputy Director, just like Louis Gassel, who is our reader in Performance Arts. So I'm sure you will enjoy tonight. We have presentations with our lovely guests today, and also that afterwards we have Q&A, so really hope that we could have some sort of in-person touch today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass my mic to Jacek for the introduction of our guests.
Thank you very much. So yes, we're going to divide this event into two halves. In the first half, we're going to go straight into Mechtel Friedrich's new book, talking about the topic of monumental cares, and then we're going to have a response by Dr. Anna Marisabella Kim, who's going to then talk specifically about the idea of creative iconoclasm. So there'll be two halves of this, and then will then be followed by a Q&A sort of chance for us to debate together ideas, and we do really like it when people ask questions and just simply bring in their perspective, and we can sort of use this also as a forum of debate. It's a really interesting topic today because, of course, we're constantly reminded about this sort of strange legacy of monuments. And while we talk about the idea of the importance of decentering culture and realizing how many monuments historically conceal also very problematic histories, and so how does the approach from a contemporary art perspective, contemporary culture perspective, how do we deal with this issue of monuments? And so, of course, in Mechtel's talk, we'll see lots of different examples of artists that have really tackled this idea, often going anti-monumentally, counter-monumentally, or indeed using Mechtel's phrase, through performative monuments. And so we use this stimulus to then also reflect on another important practice within, we often think of it as being a contemporary phenomenon of iconoclasm, but of course we know, and of course Anna Marisabella Kim will also remind us of this, that this is of course a very much a transhistorical phenomenon across the ages. We've had different examples of iconoclasm, and that is not just about a form of destruction of art, but indeed can also be in itself a form of creative practice. So we use these two ideas with the sort of a Metro's book will provide, if you like, the thesis to this event, and then Anna's provocation will become the response to that thesis, and whilst and then we'll use a point to then open up a debate, as we said before. So I'm going to first of all introduce both speakers, and I'm going to introduce perhaps each speaker one at a time, because they are to give enough information and to let that information be absorbed. So I was going to say, yes, I'm Jacek Ludwig Scarso, and thank you, Wesley, for introducing me before. And yes, we're very, very happy when we do these events with Creature, and we should also remind people to go on the website of Creature to see we've got plenty of talks happening this year. And if you go on our website, the best way to go on the website is not by remembering the link, because it's incredibly convoluted at our university, on our university website, but it's just simply Google London Creature, and then you get. And also, we should remind people that we've done an amazing. There's been a lot of work that's been happening around their website, with lots of great documentation of previous projects as well. So it's really exciting to see that. So you see more of those events by going online. So let me just introduce Professor Mechthild Widrich, who is Professor in Art History at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She works on the intersection of contemporary art and architecture. She researches and teaches on art in public space and the question of the public sphere, in particular contemporary monuments. She also works on themes such as performance art and its mediation, and on aesthetic theory. She holds an MPhil at the Art History Institute, University of Vienna, PhD in the Department of Architecture, MIT Cambridge. And recent awards include the 2022-23 University of Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study Faculty Fellow, the 2018 Literary Lions Award for Art Historical Research at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. For Creature today, she will be launching a new publication, which is, the full title is Monumental Cares, Sites of History and Contemporary Art by Manchester University Press, a part of the series Rethinking Art's Histories, published this winter 2023. But also Mechthild wrote another important book, and certainly for those of us that are linked to the MA Public Art and Performative Practices, we use both of these books as key texts, and the other book is Performative Monuments, The Rematerialization of Public Art, also by Manchester University Press. Mechthild has published also extensively in the fields of contemporary monumentality, public sphere, and performance art. So thank you very much, Mechthild, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the nice invitation and the nice introduction, Jacek, and also for the very, very fruitful discussions over the years. We've met quite a bit over the last years, but never in person. So here I am. All right, I'm gonna hop right into my topic. Monument debates in the second decade of the 21st century often turn on the question of who is represented by whom. In Monumental Cares, the book, I show how such concerns inform public history and how spatial practices, from monumental architecture to diverse forms of artistic practices, claim space for such history to be seen. Activism for and against monuments can itself be seen as the care I use in my title, which translates into specific discussions, not just of monumental program, iconography and ideology, but also, and perhaps more urgently, about monumental materials and how monuments function. If monuments and memorials were and are always as indicative of the time they are erected as of the event they remember, we need to think not just about the particular significant moment that is the target of commemoration, but also about time strata and the concept of spaces and sites. As this talk will show, to come to terms with the historicity of a site and of the art responding to it is to construct what we can call a contemporary art geography. The current debate about traditional monuments and their removal is helpful in showing the need not just for public commemoration, but for history, and to emphasize the dependence on sites. History is an essential factor in shaping not just public space in the present, but it is essential in allowing access to a functioning and heterogeneous public sphere. The monument activism of the past years confirms that monuments are nothing without the audience, and that they can be activated at different times. And two, almost anything can become a marker of activation, confirming that it is not the object or its form where the agency lies, but the interaction. On the other hand, the object and its connotations, materials, its forms and connections to traditions and modes of circulation will influence how the interaction can play out. Geography, then, with its signature activity of mapping, is a discipline useful to understanding the shifting and malleable construction that comprise real territory and its constitutive sites, their reimagination and representation in various media, moving across time and spatial scales. A project by British artist Carrie Young shows how the extramural ambitions of 1970s performance in urban and rural settings can be opened up to today's global reality. Against the dusty sky, cranes and high-rises loom in the distance. In the middle ground, amidst desert clumps of grass, a short-haired woman in a grey pantsuit walks atop a heap of what looks like discarded concrete pig. Her arms point outward, as if she's working to maintain balance atop the rubble. The title of the photograph makes explicit an art historical allusion. Body techniques, after a line in Ireland, Richard Long, 1974. It is one of Young's 2007 set of 8 body techniques, responding to canonical performances by Mirne Lademan-Michelis, Bruce Nauman, Valle Export, Dennis Oppenheim, and others. Performing in airports and building sites around Dubai and Sharjah, Young always cites her source, never her exact location. Urban expansion, resource use, individual agency, and historical consciousness are muddled together and pulled apart in performances for the camera on sites recognizable but not pinned down. It is fair to ask whether this work unmasks the globalizing process or is just another of its manifestations. Despite its art historical pedigree, body techniques is not so much about appropriation as about repetition and the drawing of distinctions between and within gestures, as we are made aware of historical difference through the performance's new sites. The very title of the series recalls one of its sources. Valle Export's body configurations, shot over a decade from 1972 to 1982, with the artist sometimes before, sometimes behind the camera. One of Young's body techniques, in fact, recreates one of the latter more closely than she did in the case of Long's photograph. Only instead of the imperious architecture of Vienna's first district, we see modular panels blocking off the building sites behind. The colliding geographies complicate the interpretation of human action. Expert used space and the camera to illuminate how the architectural environment not only conserves this milieu in its massive forms, but also how these in turn shape our subjectivity through an exaggerated behavior of bodily mimesis of architecture. This art is now retained and extended into a discussion of global economy, labor, and the visible effects on the environment. Young's work ultimately seems a rather general message, mapping familiar forms into a discourse we read first and foremost as global. Stone and concrete emerge as materials telling us about human fantasies of expansion and placemaking, about the power to shape the environment and the imagination of particular fitting and behaving bodies in their midst. It is no coincidence that Young considers the professional photographer behind the camera a technician, without aesthetic investment in the recited image. There's another narrative that is important about global capital and authoritarian politics, contracted labor, questions of individual freedom and public space, and aggressive human intervention into the planet. This also anchors Young's theories, however unofficially, in questions of ecology. Whether the work shows an ecological consciousness or numbs it, numbs us to the world of resource extraction in the way Amanda Böttskes identifies in her book Plastic Capitalism, which looks at many forms of artists' fascination with waste and industrial process, remains ambiguous. One way to draw these disparate and potentially divergent strands of Young's and other geographically comedic performance artists together is to consider them through commemoration and monument design. Like the performance artists, including Export, who memorialize their actions in public space with consequences for how we read the very spaces they inhabit, Young's line of concrete in the desert is frozen in time, however unstably and ambiguously, whatever the site's shifting hues and appearance. At the same time, contemporary monuments have come to handle contemporary or contemporaneous themes and problems in a way that opens up the monument's presumed strict orientation to the past. Of course, there are few or no contemporary problems that do not have an involved history, to say nothing of significant historical landmarks threatened with invisibility. Indeed, the two options are not exclusive. Isolated past events reveal their contemporaneity, often enough through commemoration. The most ambitious grand-scale memorial project in the United States since Michael Agard's National September 11 Memorial is the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It certainly is responding to contemporary and unfortunately ongoing and probably future instances of racial violence as much as to the murdered Black Americans whose names are inscribed upon its 805 hanging steel monolith. Just as exemplary, though apparently more remote in time and space, is the Steinset Memorial by Peter Zumthor and Louis Bourgeois in Norway, commemorating the victims of the witch trials of the 17th century. Norway's indigenous Lapp inhabitants were disproportionately targeted by this religious persecution. Here too we confront issues extending beyond the remote northeastern town of Vaso, where the elegant semi-abstract memorial architecture with its mirrored flames set in a modernist glass hall, which is Bourgeois' contribution, and the complex wooden structure, which is Zumthor's, faintly recall the violence of burning at the stake. Misogyny and colonial dominance are issues as urgent now as in the days of the witch fires, though of course differently manifested. If we are to appreciate geography's value for commemoration, we must say something more about how it relates to time, both as experience and as represented, in short, to history. Art geography might be an unfamiliar term with a checkered history of its own. Much of it played out in European art history departments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Growing out of an Enlightenment preoccupation with climate as determinant of human racial diversity in Joachim Winckelmann, Immanuel Kant, and their Romantic successors, Kunstgeography or art geography came to play a major role in German and Austrian art history in the first half of the 20th century, before tumbling into nationalist and racial explanations for differences in style in the 1930s. Since the 1970s, however, radical geography has set itself in contrast to a positivist or otherwise social scientific understanding of the discipline. It first aimed at reconsidering geography in relation to societal spaces and sites as political agendas, but soon also came to discuss the relevance of spatial conceptions to understand society. stuff I have in my book from background. British feminist geographer Doreen Massey summed up and challenged the field around the time by defining space as a construction of interactions between humans, which is inherently already also connected to political power struggles with relational and ever-changing identities. Particularly relevant to the contemporary art geography of monuments, Massey saw a shift over the 1980s in how radical geography understood its own contribution. And so the aphorism of the 1970s that space is socially constructed was added in the to the aphorism was added in the 1980s, the other side of the coin, that the social is spatially constructed too. And that makes a difference. But if spatial organization makes a difference to how society works and how it changes, then far from being the realm of status, space and the spatial are also implicated in the production of history and thus potentially in politics. For our purposes, the specific debates within leftist theory, Massey alludes to, are less significant than the intrusion of history through the codependence of space and time. Massey criticized approaches that see, quote, space as instantaneous connection. Okay, I don't have that, sorry. Space as instantaneous connection between things at one moment, and consequently as the static product of social forces. For of course, here we go, the temporal movement is also spatial. The moving elements have spatial relations to each other. For my project, this means that histories that are surfacing in the artworks should be integrated into a spatio-temporal web of relations without losing any of the concreteness of site specificity. I want to talk about another project by Ai Weiwei. Ai Weiwei's recent work can be summed up as contemporary memorials to our current global political condition. Typically, they allude to a cultural history that has been displaced or reimagined from afar, with authenticity preserved through human action and inert physical material. This kind of dynamic material specificity, history accruing to the object, extends to the siting of his installations, despite the overwhelming quantity and variety. For instance, one of his many works dealing with the current displacement and movement of refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Africa into Europe was this 2016 installation, F. Lotus, in the garden of the Baroque Belvedere Palace in Vienna. Consisting of life jackets collected from the Greek island of Lesbos, cast aside by refugees journeying to Europe, the work hardly betrays any clues to this painful source of its raw material, at least on first look. The life vests were arranged in groups of 5 in the form of decorative flowers. The structures floated in the reflecting pool fronting the main facade of the palace of Prince Eugene of Savoy, a great collector of art and a military leader most noted for fighting back the Ottoman Empire from Central Europe. Formally blending into the Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art, of architecture and garden design, the pool installation was bounded on dry ground by Ai's 2010 installation Circle of Animals, or Zodiac Cats, 13 freestanding bronze sculptures replicating a valuable set of avatars of the Chinese horoscope, plundered from the Chinese Old Summer Palace in October 1860, near the end of the Second Opium War. Thus, the installation is both significant to Vienna and broadly relevant geopolitically in the present and past moments of military aesthetic domination, giving rise to imperial cultural networks that continue to shape migration. Perhaps more striking than the floats or their synergy with the bronzes and the Belvedere garden architecture is the curious fact that seen from above, and hardly, if at all, perceptible at water level, the 201 5 West modules cohere to form a vast majuscule F, the big picture that must be sacrificed to experience its constituents on the ground. In light of these several different scales on which F. Lotus operated on and cooperated with its surroundings, it seems apt to call it an act of subversive decorum, one that addresses the fragile current state of our world. I was hardly unique in making art about the refugee crisis, or even in using the medium of the life test. The 2017 Venice Biennial displayed a gold and fur life vest designed by Turkish designer Alun Dakçınar, sorry, for mispronouncing this, a bitterly ironic commentary on the ineffectual sympathy of the well-off and those serving them in the creative industries. But the force of I's work comes not from any satirical charge, but from the transformed literalness of the discarded vests, which were combined with the Belvedere, More might be said about these interventions' pertinence to local debate, also about, refugees and how politics in Europe reacted. But I want to return to its very matter, and the history it helps us see. The material of F. Lotus, unlike the heavy bronze of the animal heads, is recycled, as the jackets were discarded on the island after their sea journey. Their shift from a used-up utilitarian object to decorative element disrupts the complacent consumption of beauty in the former garden through the battered roughness of the brightly colored synthetic fabric. And at the same time conscripts what would be garbage into a new cycle of symbolic value, the value of political commemoration. To see the network of mutually reinforcing historical references requires fine-tuning the geographical lens. And this is how I would like to enter the discussion of my last example, a recent commission of Mexican artist Emilio Rojas that combines ecology, identity politics, and performance. All of Emilio Rojas' works address the complicated relationship to land, tradition, and forced modernization. They avoid simplistic uses of authenticity, either of materials or identity, as anchors for truth, or a call for return for happier pasts. Rojas, who identifies as queer and mestizo, meaning a mixed Spanish and indigenous heritage, is seen on the cover of my book, nestled in the lap of an Abraham Lincoln monument in Chicago. But the project I will discuss happened when he was living and working in Vancouver, reflecting on the US-Canadian border, the Mexico-US border he grew up around, and the often invisible borders separating the citizens of these modern states from the indigenous peoples they displaced. In The Grass is Always Greener and or Twice Stolen Land, Rojas spent 25 hours moving a stripe of industrial sod, which is grass with roots and earth, from the art gallery of the University of British Columbia along a public highway, finally to a nearby indigenous reservation. Unrolling and re-rolling the grass in a repetitive ritual that must have become quite painful, he gives back at the end of the performance what is left. Less grass than dirt, to a creek that flows into a river and then the sea. And I'm going to just let that run. The interplay of body and sight in this work is both general and specific. But to see that, we have to attend to some of the details of the performance. Take the wordplay about the land being twice stolen. Rojas insisted on not paying for the sod carpet from his artist budget, so that he merely stole it from the university. He told me they threatened to sue him, but later dropped the case and donated it to me. But the initially stolen land is that of the Coast Salish people who inhabited the northwest coast of North America, from what is now British Columbia through most of Washington state. Specifically, the Musqueam First Nation inhabited and still inhabits present-day Vancouver, 10 minutes away by car from the University of British Columbia. a member of the Muslim. Then you see him rolling and unrolling, and he told me he estimated 6 to 7 hours, but it took 25 hours because he just kind of estimated how long the walk would take, but not that he would just going down and up and so on. And that results in an interesting video because the camera person went to sleep and came back a couple of hours later, so there's not like one whole video, but there's like different instances of the video, just a friend, how it goes. And so you only have a 6-minute video. So at first the glass architecture matched the fabric and the standardized green carpet, with each individual brass stalk the same length. This association dissolved over time, with earth migrating into the cloth, and an increasing need for the performer's body to support and carefully handle the messy material. Rojas touches on overlapping layers of meaning, contemporary and traditional, indigenous and Canadian, showing how colonial hierarchies are embedded in our use of the plant world and the territorial claims connected with it. For my argument about geography and the way art intervenes in it, this work is oriented or directed towards sites, rather than firmly occupying them. It situates us in geographies and histories, and that's pretty much what my book is about. What I like about this piece, I'm pretty much done, is that there's no way to give back the land because this is not actual grass, it's like the industrial stuff you buy in supermarkets. So there's the kind of idea that you want something back, you're not going to get it back, but he's also playing with it ironically. He also understands himself as someone who is mixed and of course also a modern person as well as an indigenous person, but he wants somehow the awareness of what's going on with the land. And I will leave it at that. Thank you. This is how it goes. Yeah, it's pretty much fine.
There are some points, and what we'll do is we'll move straight into Anna's response before opening the debate. But I just wanted to maybe take an opportunity before Anna, as Anna sets up, just to kind of look at some of the issues that you've raised. Well, one of the first ideas that'll be great to explore later on will be the idea of activation. What do we mean activation? Activation as a word tends to be so increasingly used in so many different fields, and suddenly in the context of public art has become one of those keywords that we use all the time. And in a sense, because we use this word all the time, then it's quite good to kind of recapture some of the connotations of this idea. You mentioned ideas of not just, we tend to think traditionally of the relationship between monuments and time, and typically the idea of looking back, commemorating something. But and of course we've got this sort of this really interesting etymology of the word monument, which also kind of looks at the idea of to admonish, to think of the future, to look at the past in order to avoid often mistakes in the future, for instance. And so thinking that, but also what Metal you raised so interestingly through this book is, together with the relationship to time, is also rethinking the relationship to space. And I think that important point, looking at Emilio Rojas' work, for instance, this idea that space becomes significant because monuments are so often, in a sense, the tradition of monument is almost a stereotype for colonial thinking, for imperial thinking. I take a space, I occupy it typically forever to remember something that I'm assuming will be always important. And that obviously raises the issue that we see so much now in our responses, in our contemporary responses to monuments, where we look at monuments now and say, well, and we say that maybe our values have changed, and actually those values were probably to begin with were problematic, and so this idea of thinking of beyond the occupying a space, how do we think directed at, and that is commenting upon, directing at, as opposed to occupying. And so, all these points will be developing further. But I invite people to also start maybe have a think of possible things that we can sort of extrapolate later on. And in the meantime, I'm going to invite Anna to the stage. And Dr. Anna Kim has worked in areas of extreme crisis, war, including war and refugee crises, and is regularly invited to write, advise, and speak on issues of critical contemporary concerns, bringing academic expertise to wider publics and debates. Her expertise on the force of images, iconoclasm, and the image wars led to an invitation as Associate Fellow at King's Centre for Strategic Communications. A specialist advisor on the role of images in conflict, she contributed to a new NATO journal on strategic communications. Working across sectors, she advances projects, publications, and debates on the vital role of the arts in civic thriving. Art, monuments and conflict, beauty, sustainability and urban ecologies, and culture as a human right. Dr. Kim is a member of ICON, a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts and the UK, and endorsed by the British Academy. She's also associate curator at Fondazione Metropolitan, curating his recent collaboration with the Ukrainian film resource Tactics. So we're talking, I think, Anna's going to
Given how far I've strayed from the Italian Renaissance, I should add that I have a PhD in history of art and architecture, specializing in that field, as you see, but have become more recently sort of an applied humanist and a long-time activist also in Lesbos, where I met Ai Weiwei at the time, that he was putting together that exhibition. I should say at the outset that my response is not a direct response to Bechtel's paper, because I actually didn't receive it in advance. But it really is more an informal set of reflections that gives sort of the longer view of really, whoops, and you've just seen all the fun stuff there, that gives a longer view and seeks to contextualize really what we believe to be the origins, at least in the European context, of monumental cares. And that is in the beginning, in the Renaissance, and it's a period of unprecedented artistic flourishing, as you know, that is at the same time a period of great iconoclastic destruction as part of the Protestant Reformation, which gave rise to early modern Europe. So this is the period, this is the very complex period of tensions that has been the subject of my study for many years, and then continues right up into the present, into the culture wars. So with that, I'm going to sort of run you through a set of reflections on this. Now, I think we know that historically, monuments across cultures, East and West, have stood as proxies for people and power, and not only as symbols to commemorate them, right, as to memorialize them and to memorialize histories, but actually as mediums to make them physically or even spiritually present. And I think that's an important difference to make, and important to understand this whole anthropology of images and why statues and monuments came to be so fraught, so important. As illustrated in this print that shows one of the episodes of the great Bildersturm, or the destruction of religious images in the church that swept through Northern Europe in the mid-16th century as part of the Protestant Reformation, and laid the groundwork for the transfer of objects into museums, and also the complete abolishment of decoration in Protestant churches. Many, many things came out of this iconoclastic fury, which are very interesting. And just to go back to that image, this is, this Now, on top of that, and operating at the same time with these concerns about idolatry, so the concern of the Protestant Reformation was that material objects were too base to actually host, right, any kind of representation of the sacred. But at the same time, operating was this concern that these images were becoming so lifelike, whether they were pictures or they were statues, that people were actually confusing them for real and live presences. And in the Renaissance, we know that there are stories of people actually making love to statues, that there was a real cult and idolatry of artworks. So that was layered on top of this. And this kind of cult of statues or idolatry was made possible, of course, because of the achievement of naturalism, which was, again, due to much study of ancient monuments, the ancient Roman statues and copies of Greek statues that were unearthed in Rome during its rebuilding. Now remember, Rome was a kind of a ruin, and so in excavation and the rebuilding of the city, the recovery of these great examples of antiquity began, and this is the basis for the concern with the preservation of monuments, right? In the discovery of these statues, I mean, as you can see, many of them were broken, they had lost heads, arms, and so there was also this idea, this history, this story that grew up around it, that these statues had been subject to an earlier iconoclasm, not just by barbarians, not just by the Goths and the Vandals, but by Christians themselves, which is very interesting, right? So, what we have here is what is agreed, I think, to be the first evidence, the first extant letter or evidence of this concern with monumental preservation. It was written by the painter Raphael, who was charged to oversee the construction, believe it or not, of St. Peter's. Back then, painters were pulled in to be heads of architects. And in this letter, Raphael says, look, he's writing to the Pope, Pope Leo, who's overseeing the decoration of the building of the Vatican, what is now known as St. Peter's in Rome. And essentially, he reprises what becomes this myth, this story about iconoclasm, in which he says, not only can we blame the barbarians who sacked Rome years ago, but it's also you, the present popes, who are destroying the most precious monuments that we have. In other words, what was occurring is that as workers were digging up these statues and great slabs of marble, basically they were reusing what is called spolia, these remains. They were reusing these columns, these epitaphs, without any care for their historical value. They were grinding them up and putting them into the mortar of building the new Rome. And so you can imagine the dismay when these treasures were found and think that they would simply be ground, broken up and ground into kind of construction material. So this is, as I said, it's sort of seen as the beginnings of proto-archaeology, of monumental care and concerns written to popes, and also, interestingly, implicating them and blaming them for the destruction or the lack of care for monuments. Now, why? So I think there are a couple of things that are very important here. These iconoclastic myths and histories that were used to protect monuments, as opposed to the real iconoclasm of the Protestant Reformation. So in Italy, they were rehearsing these myths of iconoclastic destruction, blaming themselves, right, in order to preserve monuments. Secondly, that it was coming from an artist, right? It's not coming from some position of power, it's not coming from a pope, it's coming from an artist, which is also very interesting, and we'll return to that. Why were these so valuable? Well, It wasn't, of course, because they were mediations of any kind of presence, but they did hold within them all of the wisdom of antiquity, of art making, which would be lost if their physical remains were destroyed. So for the artists of the Renaissance, for Michelangelo and others who studied these, and eventually patrons like the Medici who collected them, and popes who put them in the first collections, these were the exemplars of artistic excellence that held all of the lineaments, all the rules of making art that made great art possible. So that was the concern here. Now, as Raphael was also overseeing the construction of St. Peter's, he was also part of a workshop that was decorating the interior. And this is an example from the room of Constantine, if you've been to the Vatican, where he meticulously, from his archaeological knowledge, rejuvenates and replicates and completes these broken fragments that he has been studying. And what's interesting about these rooms is also this kind of collapsed temporality, where historic narratives are folded with real live events and popes inserted within these histories, statues coming alive, everything brought to life again. So claiming pictorially this kind of continuity between past and present, which is how these myths gain their power. At the same time that we have this incredible praise of classical monuments and antiquity, there is this shadowy image, and this has been sort of the entry point for kind of an alternative insight into what was occurring at this time. And if you can make out here in the right-hand corner, there's a craftsman, an ancient craftsman, who's actually raising his hammer, and it looks as if he's going to destroy a statue, right, rather than craft it. And at the top we see sort of these strange images of headless, broken statues as well. And it's been a study of this little shadowy image that has given rise to this idea of the concern that was operating even in the celebration of classical antiquity with the concern with the idolatry, right, of images and valuation of these artworks. So this kind of paradox and complexity that I think also refers to the concerns of the Reformation. And then we see the very same image reprised, this shadowy image, which is in the Raphael rooms, in this symbol of Michelangelo, who's creating a sculpture. And so in this respect, we have a sense of the way that making and breaking are always related in the production of sculpture. Here, it's not clear whether Michelangelo is actually, he looks almost to be, breaking open this sculpture. And in fact, we know, and it's part of the history, the biography of Michelangelo is the first sort of iconoclastic artist who broke the mold of art, but also famously was known for this terribilità, this terrible temper in which he broke his own statues, out of frustration. And also, I think, and I've written about the way that he broke his own classical forms of sculpture as a form of internalized iconoclasm and critique. And so here we see this very strange image. This is the torso and sort of a hanging arm of what is his very last sculpture. It's a Pietà, it's a standing Christ held by Mary in the background. And we see almost this kind of, striation of flesh, scraping, but mostly what we notice is his breakage metaphorical form of Christ and almost a kind of flaying of the body. And this goes hand in hand with these spiritual writings in which he reflects upon his whole artistic career and the idolization of art and also his reputation in a kind of iconoclastic way. So this was, for me, an entry point to think about the way that artists of the past, in a period that we assume to be, a period of maximum artistic flourishing, were actually inscribing in their own artworks a kind of self-reflexive criticality through iconoclastic procedures, which is what I call kind of creative iconoclasm, which doesn't seek to absolutely destroy an image or sculpture, but rather to inscribe this self-reflexive critique, to create this broken object that then has these layers of meaning. And we see this kind of repetition. This is contemporary artist Michael Landy, who was an artist in residence at the National Gallery, who was one of the first to look at religious art and produce some contemporary art in dialogue with it. And here we have, once again, Michelangelo's David. You sort of press this electrical button and the hand begins to destroy it as a symbol of the way that Christian art has always been about a kind of aesthetic destruction of the body, of the classical body. Just going back, this research, which was funded, I was part of an international group funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council years ago. As a graduate student, then contributed to a major exhibition at Tate Britain called Art Under Attack, Histories of Iconoclasm, which then looked at these historical precedents from the Reformation all the way up to contemporary artists who use iconoclasm as a form of artistic strategy. So I'll end by, that was about a decade ago. Since then, I'll just end with a few images of artworks that I've been in dialogue, artists and that I've been in dialogue with, who use iconoclasm again as a kind of form of creative destruction to open up certain kinds of meanings and histories. This is a project by Rietveld Architecture, Eric Rietveld in Amsterdam, and his studio, in which they cut through these hermetically sealed World War II bunkers that line a series of coasts in the Netherlands that were basically impermeable objects, but they have cut through these bunkers to allow ordinary people to walk through them and to experience them in a completely different way, opening up that history of what otherwise was sort of, an impenetrable object. I've also written about Vienna Lang, who's an artist based here in London, who has done a series that revisits the disused monuments of the Soviet period that are in various parks by iconoclastically inserting the female figure into the object. Then more recently, in the city where I lived for many years, Richmond, Virginia, I've long been in conversation over the overwriting of these monuments, which then became very famous subjects of Black Lives Matter protests, perhaps some of the most significant of these past few years. So another form of what I would call creative iconoclasm, which then eventually led to the removal of the statue, a real kind of iconoclasm. And just coming up to the present day, working with Jacek on an exhibition in the project space that we're curating in Venice, which we'll be visiting this weekend for the close of our exhibition. I have curated a series of films in support of artists from Ukraine, where I've been active for many years. And I just want to play at the end a bit of one of the films by two young Kiev-based artists, Yanema Maluchik and Roman Kime, that have been featured in museums across Belgium this year, called Explosions in the Museum, in which they record shelling near a museum in southern Ukraine, which has housed a very important historical set of objects which were looted by the Russians in advance of the liberation of the city of Kherson. And so using again this sort of iconoclastic imagery in a creative way. So let's see if I can.
Of a dog. On this pedestal, we will firmly fix the 66-centimeter marble Stela of Leox, dated to the 5th century BC, which was found 128 years ago by our countryman, the villager Makar Melnik, from the village of Barutinye. Here, on a high stand, with a high narrow neck, we will again place the thin handles and egg-shaped body of a black figured 59-centimeter Pan-Athenic amphora dated to the end of the 4th or first half of the 3rd century BC. On this pedestal, we will install a hewn and polished fragment of a white marble column on which the text "Dedication to Apollo Prostrate" is carved. I hope the text will not be damaged, and we will be able to read it again if we can find it.
Thank you.
There's so many ideas that this is raising, and Anna too, in terms of some of the points that I think could also be brought into this discussion. There are so many points, of course, but there was a particular idea that you raised at the beginning of how monuments, and particularly looking at statues are not just the idea of commemorating somebody, but also this idea of making them physically present in the space, which obviously adds this additional layer. And another point that you made, Anna, that was really interesting for our debate today, is also this notion of the embodied knowledge that is intrinsic to any artwork. So the artwork is both what it represents, but it also conceals knowledge of how it was made. And by destroying that, we lose also that as well, which is also another really interesting layer there. You went from the idea of how the Reformation created this sort of very active form of iconoclasm, and it was interesting to think then of how the sort of the Catholic world responded in the sort of the counter-Reformation of almost fetishizing monuments even more, and the idea I think there's something about this is quite intentional. This idea of the fetishization of the iconic sort of image. So how we make you talked about the idea of idolatry through the creation of myths around images, but also how they literally become somehow again in sort of kind of again fetishized, I would say. And thinking of that the idea that you mentioned about the creative iconoclasm being not just about destroying, but also but effectively kind of radically reframing something, which then kind of leads nicely to also Mechtel's point that you made in both this book, but also in your Performative Monuments book, on how we address these points. So I'm going to open. This was just a list of some of the so many ideas. I suppose one of the things that I wanted to start the debate from, whilst then we revisit some of these ideas, is also because now we've been confronted more and more recently by another form of iconoclasm, which is of course the idea of for instance, defacing important paintings, for instance, the just of oil. We're very confronted. This is obviously something that in the media we've seen a lot. So we're confronted with this very immediate example of iconoclasm, which of course it's quite whatever one's position. So I think it's feel free to obviously share whatever position one may have, but it's not so much whether in terms of the debate is that should we do this or not. But what's interesting from our context is why do we do it? Why does that artwork take on this additional layer? In a sense, the Van Gogh's sunflowers become a form of monument the moment they're defaced within that context. And so it's interesting to think of those points. So I wonder whether maybe we could start from this very a recent thing that we see on the news, increasingly frequently, and perhaps then work our way back. And while we do this, again, I invite the people from our audience to think of also other things that perhaps either our observations we can add, but also to feel free to also ask any questions about this topic. So shall we, starting from this point, so again, something that we're confronted with more, increasingly, and obviously brings in those ideas of iconoclasm. How do we think of this phenomenon from these ideas that you've just explored? I don't know if maybe Anna, do you want to start?
Yes, I remember when we had the opening for the Tate Britain exhibition, which of course was a historical exhibition, and this group called Dada's Little Bitch. Well, they marked up our poster. They're like, oh, we're the real iconoclasts. We actually go and break. We get thrown in jail for breaking things. We don't just talk about them historically. So yes, it's still a kind of strategy. And now art has, probably the Renaissance is a good place to look for the way in which art and collections came to symbolize very, great powers. It was the popes that first began to collect these, and it was the Reformation that sent objects into museums. This is the beginning of all of that, the high valuation of art to a different sphere. But yes, art and the monuments of culture and civilization, have become stand-ins for that kind of power that needs to be, that can attract attention to political causes.
Yeah.
And on the far side of things, which is also a field that I've worked in, is of course the kind of destruction of cultural heritage that was perpetrated by ISIS. I was an advisor on art and terrorism at that time, in the way that they were using the destruction of monuments in a kind of terroristic culture. But yes, we continue to see the function of artworks and monuments in this regard.
Yeah, and there's and what's also interesting, there's a sort of paradox there, because if you think of the destruction of the defacing again of certain paintings, when you think of I was reminded by in your talk, Anna, about this idea of iconoclasm and how it's now embedded in the very existence of modern art. Modern art is based on iconoclastic thinking.
Yes.
And so it's quite a paradox that there's this painting such as now I'm thinking of the recent one wasn't Van Gogh, but in terms of that's right,
which was
exactly.
also the victim was slashed by.
Yes, that's right.
Some
And
jets.
exactly.
Yes.
So it was twice the victim of iconoclasm, and at the same time, it's in itself a sort of an iconoclastic artwork
Yes.
in the spirit of really sort of radically kind of countering the conventions of
Yes.
classical art, for instance. So there's so many different sort of so as a phenomenon again, whichever our position might be in terms of the legitimacy of this type of action, but it's the process of this action is incredibly interesting from this sort of perspective. Yeah. And so, Meta, what would you say?
I mean, what is interesting is that it seems to be very much connected to the musealization of the artworks. It's not so much just about the artworks, but about the structure of the museums, the way they are being financed today, the way philanthropy works, and who is doing, who is paying for them. And in a way, then they still stand in for some kind of inflexible bourgeois culture as a whole, it seems, right? So when we're talking about the climate activists, for example, if maybe there's recent development, but I thought that in most cases they are being iconoclastic without destroying things, right? Which I think is extremely interesting. So they're using the framework of iconoclasm and the shock value that comes from it, but they are, gluing themselves to the frames. Okay, that was difficult to repair, but still, right? Or on the glass, but there's no actual act of destruction, but it's the threat of the destruction. And I find that quite interesting, at least, right? I'm obviously not for the destruction of actual paintings, but as a shock value to the bourgeois idea of a museum, and that culture has to be preserved forever. I find it, it's a good move in terms of, you want attention, certainly.
And maybe this then nicely segues with your point that agency in this regard lies in the interaction, like with the artwork. Yeah, I think about.
It gets old a little bit, right? But
Yes.
for a moment, I thought, okay, it's an interesting gesture.
Yeah, I think you're precisely right that, that's why I made the comment about how these artworks, beginning in the Renaissance, begin to take on this cultural value as, representative of a certain kind of power and wealth and structures, as you say, from bankers to popes. And then I guess we could also go to the point about, in terms of iconoclastic gestures or defacing of monuments, that it is in that activity that they become most visible and alive, right?
Yeah.
Things that are otherwise invisible. And that's the other double feature about iconoclasm, is that in processes of destruction, you're actually creating a new kind of visibility, which I think is very interesting.
And it's sort of, again, something that we often raise, for instance, in studies of public art. The MA public art students know this very well. There's sort of this sort of paradox of monuments that the monument becomes invisible, and yet it can still be deeply problematic, for instance, because we might be so used to seeing a statue that might be problematic, but we see it in the background, and we see, and so it becomes almost doubly problematic, because it sits in our subconscious.
Yeah.
It becomes sort of subliminal thinking. It becomes natural, in inverted commas, to see it around. And on this note of this sort of power of these images, shall we open to a bit the debate? Does anybody want to? I'm just going to go around our audience and invite some contributions, thinking, thoughts, questions, whatever you want.
Hi, thank you for the cool quiz. It was really interesting. I think probably I would look at it a little bit differently, insofar as one comes into contact not with an object but with culture, and that, for example, the idea of iconoclasm itself comes from, I think, as you were alluding to in early part of your talk, about One is a culture of iconoclasm, which I potentially talk about instrumental iconoclasm, which is to do with the object and what the object might represent, rather than perhaps a historical one, which was more cultural and embodying ideas that were being actually undertaken or destroyed at the time. So I would put probably the destruction of Palmyra, funnily enough, within that type of thing. But they didn't know what they were doing, but what they were destroying was something with deep cultural value. So then it made me think, okay, so monument is a word that we both used a lot. And it seems to me that narratives that we're talking about were discussed in an interesting essay, as you probably both know, by Nietzsche around the 1870s, called The Use and Abuse of History for Life, where he actually splits history into three. Antiquarianism, which was in a sense what you were alluding to in terms of the value of history. Monumentalism, which he actually talks about as being ideas imposed upon something to make it more monumental, and that doesn't have to be historical, that can be present. So you monumentalize something that you want to make equal. But he then moves on towards the best one, which is critical, which is the way in which you then make new history, you make new understanding. And so I was interested, because obviously Alois Riegel, and you're obviously from the Austrian school, sort of. Alois Riegel's The Cult of Monuments, and that whole link back to people like Hans Sedlmayr, and the idea of...
Well, I covered Sedlmayr.
Yeah. The whole idea of a culture being an identity. And what it seems to me that Nietzsche was trying to do at that time was, within that sort of post-Enlightenment culture, try to articulate those different levels of monumentality without mentioning God, which is sort of a part of what he calls it. And so I was just interested in if Nietzsche's understanding of monumental was something that either of you had considered as a part of your conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So in fact, I was, I read the Nietzsche, of course, but I was much more interested in the Riegel, Alois Riegel, because he was a conservator in Vienna, and as part of being the conservator around 1900, he came up with like an incredibly lengthy subdivision of what monuments could be. And so that was for his work, but I think the part that still interests us is that he talks about the value of the audience and the interaction. So he's pretty radical in thinking about function. He says, if you have a torn piece of paper and that is the last piece you have from a culture, then it's a monument, right? So in terms of it could be anything. And on the other hand, as a conservator, he looked at the main cathedral in Vienna, which started in the Romance time, and then, it's like 300 years of being re-inverted and rediscovered and changed and so on and so forth. And he says it's not about going back to any kind of authentic version. It's about going back to a version that can be fragmented and from different times, but that allows us an interaction with kind of a vague notion of what a past is, right? Even if it's not an authentic past. So I think that was much more influential for me in how I thought about monuments. So coming in from the present always, coming in from the audience and the function, rather than thinking about Nietzsche's, monumentalization of history and criticality of history. Yeah.
Nietzsche was a
And I read Sedlmayr, but I do not. Yeah, he was a big Nazi too, so I'm not interested in
Nietzsche was a big influence when I studied my first PhD studies in philosophy, and I think that he is one of the great iconoclastic thinkers. And there's which, what interests me in this period that I'm looking at, this overlap of Renaissance Reformation, is the way that that artists themselves become, self-reflexively critical, and it's inscribed in the art books. And this kind of criticality we associate with modernism, basically, with the birth of early modern Europe. But what I was trying to show in my research is that that it's been overlooked, the way in which these Renaissance artists, which were lauded for great artistic creativity and flourishing, were themselves extremely self-critical and very aware of these urgent cultural debates. And as I said, I think inscribing it physically into their work, which I find really interesting.
And I think and it's interesting with these questions. The Christian's question also points at the philosophy of the artistic sort of and the idea behind the definition of monument. And it strikes me also that of course also there has been a movement, not only an art movement in countering monuments, but also a philosophical movement in countering the philosophy of monuments. So, for instance, in the theories of thinking of the anti-monumentality or counter-monumentality, and of course, indeed, in your book, Performative Monuments, and looking then linking those in a sense through in Anna's lens, sort of using these contemporaries to revisit also the historical practices as well, almost against themselves, becomes also a really interesting way of how do we kind of use these terms and the opportunities that they continue to give us in this analysis. Is there any further questions? Thank you. Yes, please. Good. I like questions. It doesn't mean that I walk a lot, but that's good.
Hi, firstly, thank you so much for the very thought-provoking presentations. I'm just going to go back on some of the stuff that you were kind of alluding to before. I thought it was really interesting kind of talking about the creation of mythologies, and you're kind of referring about institutions and really the interaction relative to the museum or whatever kind of institution they belong to. And I was really struck by you kind of saying, I wasn't aware of Rojas, by the way, it was really great, and you kind of mentioned that he's kind of not going to get back, and maybe there's kind of futile exercise there. But actually, I think land back as policy is a political kind of movement that is happening in North America, as opposed to Ai Weiwei in a way. There is argument to say that he makes trauma palatable for institutions, and I just wonder to what extent within that framework can we escape this kind of institutional mythology and the kind of aestheticization and kind of making a metaphor of trauma.
Good question. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I was like, do I really have to answer this?
Yeah.
What a great question. So I think with Rojas, I think the futility lies in that he doesn't think you can just go back in time, right? Because modernization happened, modernity happened, so this is all part of what he's alluding to, no? But I do think he'd be interested in a discussion about giving land back or whatever. I mean, that is always the issue. Okay, I don't necessarily have an issue with representation because I think there's a lot of power in it. And even, the activism on the ground, since 2015, the monument activism, they worked so much with representation, with social media, with photographic images, and I think that's fair enough. Is that an aestheticization? Probably, but again, I think that's fair game, and that is part of the power even of a counter-monumentality. Institutionalization, I mean, particularly, let's say in the case of Ai Weiwei or these big names, it was, in his case, a conscious decision to not dislike him because a lot of people do and attack him for his big success in museums. I do think that museum as a semi-public space, or is part of how we're creating culture. I think in my opinion, his work is still meaningful enough that I can talk about it, even though there are these big institutions behind him. So I guess I'm just. I don't think that the institution automatically corrupts. There's always a little bit of corruption, but public space is also not neutral. Nothing's neutral. There's always behavior, there's always power. It's just clear what it is if you're talking about, the Guggenheim or whatnot. And I think you can be against whatever their trustees are and still appreciate what they're showing inside, because from my interaction with curators, they're doing their thing, and then the trustees are doing the other thing, which is oil and weapons and worse.
I give the floor to Metropolitan on this, but I just want to say that, having been on Lesbos during that tragedy, and there was a lot of criticism of Ai Weiwei and his the way he instrumentalized certain images. The works that he did go on to display publicly, whatever your criticism of him and how he's so highly regarded, the work that he does, he really did, I think, does capture. He does the scale of what he's able to achieve, precisely because he is such a well-regarded artist, does bring incredible public attention to these. It matches the scale of the tragedy, what he's able to achieve in terms of attention and the monumentality of some of these installations. So it's very, it's very mixed, to be sure.
And again, this sort of idea of how the institution plays a part in this is interesting, and it makes me think again. Our ideas of monuments can be very much linked to notions of institutionalization. Something becomes, monument. Something becomes a monument when there is an institution that somehow, be it physically or simply ideologically, is allowing it to happen. So it's interesting to think of that in terms of, does any act that uses monumentality against itself, be it iconoclasm, anti-monumentality, and anti-monument, counter-monument, do they need to be anti-institutional? Or, of course, again, there's the different layers that we've been sort of exploring. So it's a brilliant question. I'm very mindful that we've gone past the scheduled time, but I do want to ask if anybody has a pressing question. Thank you, Kaza, so we can, because we did start late.
Thank you so much. So my question is about the same piece done by Rojas, but from another point of view, which is mostly about its form. So, because I can say, first of all, it's a personal issue for me. In a way, many things could be considered as monuments, So the question is there any difference or I can say boundary or line between monuments and a performance piece?
Yeah, good point.
Okay, so I use monuments for works that allow access to history. So I'm pretty radical in defining it through function. In performative monuments, I go all the way into performances and claim that the documentation or the photographic piece is that which stabilizes it, right? So there is some kind of object. I've been a little bit less certain about that in recent times. So now I do think you need something in public space. It can be very small. Maybe it's because of social media, maybe it's because I'm getting old, I don't know, right? So I think that maybe with the success of performance in public space, I started doubting that it's actually as effective, long term as I thought it would be through memory and photos and so on and so forth. So now I think some kind of performative prop maybe is needed for an interaction to happen. And you know, with the offers, you see, of course, where it was cut out. So you see something at least for a year or however long they're gonna need it, and you have the little piece. In this case, I think it's great as access to history, but in the book I do go from monuments to monumental concerns, so he would rather be in the monumental concerns category. That would be my answer/excuse.
Brilliant. Does anybody have any yes, Ricardo? Let's hear from you.
Not going to be too much of a personal question, but like I think about stories like Barbara Chesler Booth, for example. She's one of the first, I would like to say first artists, contemporary artists who were really concerned with the idea of monument from back to the 50s already. What I was thinking is that she created a series of monuments dedicated to Malcolm X because she thought that nobody did that before for his memory, and it was a way for her also to kind of like feel close to her own country after his assassination. So my question is, do you think that looking at monument as, remembrance and memory, do you think there has been, or who would they be, the figures that have been under-recognized in history that you would make a monument for?
Okay, I think there are many, but I'm not convinced you should put individuals
Yes.
on pedestals. I don't think it works, and you're gonna find 300 bad things about Malcolm X. I mean, I could name a few, and about his personal life. So if you use the person for a cause, right? Because that's what with Malcolm X stands for, potentially for a good cause or for an interesting cause. I think it. No, I'm against people even. No, I don't think it works for me.
No, I agree, and it's a very difficult issue, particularly when you see the commission of now works for feminist history, suffragettes, ones I think,
It's a problematic genre.
Yeah, it is problematic, and I also think that in this day and age it's really ineffective.
Yeah.
So, in any case, I'm also not.
But I think you can recognize the
building
people
yes,
different.
you can
history
recognize
through.
it and actually, having seen that show of Barbara Chase at a certain time, I mean, what she did create was so non-personal in some way. I mean, just this incredible, armature and abstraction. I think, yes, if we're going to go in some direction, that it would be that. So,
I agree wholeheartedly.
with good artists, not just doing real more, ugly bronze statues
Yeah.
in a certain tradition.
Yes. Yes.
But it is an interesting. It's a very good question. How do we kind of and in a way, to some extent, part of this contemporary thinking of monuments is also about transcending this notion of the individual being the representative of a cause. Very problematic, of course, because there are it does lead to lots of different questions. Ultimately, because we've got still plenty of individuals being represented, and there will always be the argument as to, well, okay, but how do we balance that if we never name the people that we should represent? And it brings those questions, but of course the ultimate also argument about the idea of the glorification of the individual is always problematic somehow, even just because you end up finding stuff at some point that may not be that perfect. So on these notes, there's been so many wonderful comments also by the audience. It's really great to see this. I wanted to remind people that we've got the discount code, which is 3030, right? Is that the one, right? Okay.
30% off.
For 30% off, and we of course will make this part of our library collection, and of course it's already on our library catalogue as well. And Just a couple of other points, just to remind you to do please check our research centres. I'm going to include both Creature, of course, our research centre for creative arts, cultures and engagement, and of course we've got our Cube sister centre, specifically more for urban ecologies and built environment. And in fact, there's going to be a professorial lecture tomorrow at 6, I believe, and that's by Professor Nicholas Temple. Also, really worth checking out. So lots of events to look forward to. Check us out on